There
Yeah,
you go. Thank you, Max. Okay.
no problem.
So let's at least see if that worked. And I'll go
Yep.
back to that. Okay. How's that? Oh yeah, it
Yeah,
does
it's
have
working.
good call, Max. Okay, thank you.
No
Sorry
problem.
about that, you guys. That's good. Well, we'll start from here then. But and we'll see if again Zoom told me it was recording from the start on a setting that I changed. So I'll dig in the files. If I find the full file, I'll upload that, or I'll upload this from the start. Um, so hopefully you guys can reference this. I'll put, as I say, when I talk about some of the technicals as well, I'll put a lot of charts and just, there's different information in here. So this might be helpful for you guys to just, I'll gloss over it now and we can go back and just look at a screenshot or something and go through the recording there.
Fine.
So yeah,
Thank you.
so the exposure triangle. Exposure triangle is basically how you light an image. A camera works on some basic properties. It's literally photography is literally writing with light, and what you're doing is allowing light to come through a hole in the camera, a shutter through your lens, and you're recording the pixels, the information that light in RGB values records onto a sensor plane. That used to be a film sensor or a piece of glass plate when they used to do glass plate photography. These days, it's a digital sensor with light meters that register different values of R, G, and B, and then record that as a pixel, and then you multiply that by however many millions of pixels fit onto a sensor. This one is 24 megapixels, something like that. They make cameras that are 80 or whatever megapixels now. I just saw a cell phone that I think was a new Samsung or something. It's like 64 megapixels in a cell phone, which I'm like, that all that sounds to me like is massive file size. At that point, on a small camera with a small sensor, you actually there comes like diminishing returns when you get so many megapixels. So megapixels is one of the things that a camera manufacturer really pushes and tries to sell you on. But really, if you're around, I mean, I've taken great images with like 8 megapixel cameras, and they still hold up even on 4K monitors and stuff like that. Or sometimes you're cropping a macro image, you're throwing away a lot of those pixels anyways. So just some food for thought when you're shopping around for those things. Um, the more important thing to actually generating an image is how you're recording light on all those pixels. And there's sort of three main axes that pull the light either darker or lighter. So ISO is one of the easiest ones to think about because all it does is it's basically the sensitivity of your sensor. So lower ISO numbers like ISO 200 means that you're recording less light, or the image is darker for the same given light. Now, if you up your ISO, you're brightening your image for the same amount of light, the same source of light. So ISO 1600, 3200, 6400, those are helpful, especially when it's really dark. I use high ISO a lot when I'm photographing night scene, star trails, or photographing a meteor shower, or the Milky Way, stuff like that. Um, so that one is sort of just basically up and down. Aperture and shutter work the same way, but they also have effects on the look of the resultant image, and I'll talk about that in a second. But basically what you can think of, shutter speed is another pretty easy one to think about. If you hold your camera shutter open for longer, it lets in more light. So something like a 10-second exposure, you hold the shutter open, it's capturing light, and then you finally close it. That's going to be a very bright image compared to if you had a 100th of a second shot where you just recorded a little bit of photons, right? 1/8,000th of a second is about the fastest most SLR cameras can shoot. Incidentally, that B photograph was probably something like a 50,000th of a second, and I can talk about how you actually can get to that high of a shutter speed, which you can't do just with the mechanics of the camera. Um, and then aperture is the actual physical opening in your lens, and you can look at that a lot of different ways. You can actually see, there's my aperture ring, you can actually see the aperture changing in this lens. And so the wider open that hole is, right, you're going to let more light in for a given exposure. The lower it is, the more pinhole closed it is, the less light you're going to be letting in. But both of those also have some impacts on the resultant image. So I'll talk about those here in just a second. But this is basically kind of what it's measuring. You're just talking about the overall how properly exposed your image is. This image on the left here is quote unquote too dark to be a perfect. You might want that in an image, and there's lots of reasons why you might want to darken a background if you're going to then add flash or something like that. And that's some of the mastery that we can talk about later, getting more comfortable with the different camera settings. But most people look at this and go, that's a little bit too dark. So that's a -2 exposure value on your meter. There's usually an exposure meter, and if you're right in the middle, that's properly exposed. We can also talk about histograms. I won't get into that too much here. But basically, this image has either had too low of an ISO, too small of an aperture, or too short a duration of a shutter speed, right? Or some combination of all of those. And the image on the right has had the opposite. The shutter's been open for too long, the ISO is too high. You blew out the shot, it's too bright. So mostly we're looking to expose in the middle here and have a proper exposure. And this is the same across SLR cameras, even cell phone cameras, although it might be obfuscated. So on your SLR, you'll probably have a button like this. It's a plus minus exposure. This can change exposure compensation, which is a slightly different thing than aperture and shutter. You can change all these in combination. And again, it's kind of a lot of SLR cameras have auto settings that are like an automatic car, and you can let it do its thing. But sometimes, like a manual car, it's nice to take control and take over driving and set every setting how you want. And I would argue manual is absolutely the way to shoot for macro, especially once you understand the components of it and adding lighting, things like that. But you can control it a little bit with a button like that. You might have an autofocus lock that also locks the exposure value, the EV. So pressing this button on an SLR might say AF lock / EV lock. So you could either lock the focus by holding that button down, or you can set it to lock both the focus and the exposure, or just the exposure. But you can also do this with cell phones, and this is one of my biggest tips for getting better cell phone macro photography, or really better any cell phone photography. How many times have you taken a photo of, well, not anymore in COVID, but you go out in downtown and it's nighttime, it's a dark sky or a beautiful sunset behind you, and you give somebody your cell phone and they take a photo, and you have a beautiful photo of the city and then 3 silhouettes, and you're standing there dark, dark as day, dark as night. Or they focus on you, and then all behind you, the city is black, or you don't record the sunset. It's being able to balance that exposure across the whole image is what you can do with exposure compensation, or finding on like a cell phone, you have these little sliders here where you can brighten or darken the image. And usually those sliders will then allow you to set it and lock it. And often that allows you to lock the focus as well. So this will be really critical when I talk about how to best use that for cell phone macro photography. It's kind of locking and able to take control of what the image actually looks like. Same here, you'll have a brightness meter, zoom, things like that, and usually a little lock button that you can actually lock the exposure, lock the focus, and that helps you when you recompose and try to focus on your small little insect that you're trying to photograph. ISO we talked about is basically just the brightness of an image. Lower ISOs are darker, higher ISOs bring up the brightness of your image, with the one added caveat that high ISOs tend to result in grainier images. You get a lot more noise, grain noise, because your sensors, your pixels are overheating and giving off heat noise in a lot of cases. So that's one caveat. I would feel comfortable with most modern day cameras going up to at least ISO 800 or 1600 for most of my work. And that gives you quite a big range to play with in terms of exposure. Shutter speed, we talked about, can affect the overall exposure, but also what shutter speed does can be used to record motion in your image. So a really fast shutter speed will tend to freeze motion, and slower shutter speeds tend to blur anything that's moving in the image, right? And you can see that photographing a bird in flight, or photographing a airplane with a propeller, or a car with its wheels zooming across the ground. If you photographed an Indy car at a really fast shutter speed, you actually might not get a very pleasing photo. You'd get a sharp image, but it might look like somebody just went and parked the car on the racetrack, because there's no motion, there's no conveying that. So you could try to freeze an image, get a really nice sharp image, and that can be really important for doing things like insects in flight. John and Kendra Abbott are some phenomenal insect in flight photographers and have pioneered a lot of this. And one of the really interesting things about this image is this was some of the basis for some new natural history that hadn't really been observed before. This is a sylphid carrion beetle that actually, when it's in flight, uses two of its legs to fold up and hold its elytra flipped over and reversed like a car hood up over its back. And the elytra on the top are black, nondescript, a few markings on top, but underneath they're this bright, vibrant yellow. And it's hypothesized that this could be a form of aposematism, warning coloration, or a startle coloration. When this beetle takes off and flies away, presumably from a predator, it flashes these elytra and holds them like that in flight to mimic a wasp, or to say, hey, get away from me. And that's difficult to see with your naked eye, but when you stop the motion and you freeze it like this, you can actually see the morphology of what's going on, that it's actually using its legs to hold the elytra behind its back, which is just really cool, really mind-blowing, that you might not otherwise see with a slowed down image. Now, using a slower shutter speed, though, could communicate motion, like in this image of driver ants moving across in a huge army ant raid column that they do. This really communicates that these guys have motion. They're all moving in one direction, things like that. So these are the artistic elements that come in with the technicals of how to actually expose an image. Aperture, I talked about, we showed with that with the lens, it's measured in f-stops. So the smaller f numbers have this big wide open aperture, f2.8 or something like that. What that also results in, though, from the picture quality standpoint, is a shallower depth of field. And that's kind of our enemy in macro. Sometimes we're really trying, it's like looking through a microscope, you're really trying to extend the depth of field because it's so razor thin when we're talking about tiny insects, tiny little small things. But also a wide open aperture would allow you to shoot in lower light, which could be an important consideration. And it allows you to shoot at those higher shutter speeds if you're looking to freeze action, things like that. Again, this is more important with sort of wildlife photography than it is with macro, where we're relying a lot on flash and lighting that I'll talk about there. Conversely, a large f number, you have a small little aperture. And this tends to give you broader depth of field elements in focus from the front all the way to the back of the image. Again, we're pushing that margin already with macro. I tend to shoot most of my macro images up around f16, f14 at a minimum, depending on the lens. Here's a visual example of that. This was a cherry blossom shot at, I think, f2.8, something like that, versus the same picture at f16. And what you can see with this, if I wanted to communicate detail, you can see certainly a lot more detail in the background. You can actually make out all the stamens and things like that on almost every individual flower, versus this shot, right? What's nice about the shallow depth of field in this case is I'm actually directing your eye just to this flower in the center, because everything else is out of focus, and is what's called bokeh, is this creamy out of focus effect in the background. And this is what wedding photographers love, right? If you photograph people, you tend to want to get their eyes in focus and nothing else, not your crazy aunt in the background of the wedding. You diffuse her and blend her out of focus. So that's one way you can control what your viewer pays attention to in your photograph. But depth of field is also dependent upon the distance between your camera and your subject and the subject in the background. I could photograph the Grand Canyon at f2.8 and it would look the same as if I photographed it at f16 because I'm focusing basically at infinity. So the background is way out of the way. But if I held my hand up and focused on my hand, I could either have detail in the Grand Canyon if I shot at f32, or no detail and it would just be a color, a color blur if I shot at a small aperture. So it kind of depends on how close you are and how close your background is. And that's something to pay attention to and think about when you're framing and shooting macro images where you're down low on your knees. Maybe you can get a little lower so that your subject is right here on this flower. Maybe there's a plant right behind it. If you get a little lower, your background suddenly becomes just the sky or a tree that's 20 meters away. That makes for a much more pleasing background, much less busy background. So there's lots of ways that you can do that. Yeah, especially again when we're talking about really close working distances and such a small depth of field that we have to play with macro images. This is an example. Let me check the chat. Okay, everybody's going well. So this is an example of a pretty narrow depth of field, even for a macro image. And again, I think Nikki Bay is a fantastic photographer. You guys should all check out. I mean, I think Nikki took this at actually at least f8 or 11 or something like that. It's just he's so zoomed in this was with a 2.5x, I think, lens. So he's really zoomed in. You're really narrow working distances, but you can control the focus to focus on your viewer's attention on the turbulent eyes of this mayfly, which is really cool. You could go the opposite way. Whoops, let's get back to here. And do something like focus stacking. And this is one of the things I could bring up and talk about with microscope imaging or specimen imaging, which you can do with an SLR camera as well. It sometimes is helpful to take planes of an image and then stack them all together so that you get you show focus at every level. It's kind of a way to cheat and essentially shoot it like f480 or something like that. But if you did try to close down your aperture, what you often get, like when you squint with your eyes, you get a lot of diffusion and diffraction, and it can actually end up with a softer image. This is a way of striking the balance between getting focal planes of focus, combining them all into one image so that it looks hyper-focused. But that could be really important, especially for specimen imagery, where you need to show the shape of the coxa as well as the number, how many antennal segments there are, or something like that. You still want to light them well. There's lots of examples of sort of how to do this. This was a stacked image of something like 50 stacks to get all the pits, everything from the wing venation front to back on this cuckoo wasp. Here's one of you can do this with live insects if they sit still long enough. I was really lucky with this Megacephala tiger beetle that it sat still in my white box studio. And this is sort of the resultant image where you can see, you can make out detail in the back leg all the way up to the tips of the antennae. There's everything is sharp throughout the image. But a single image would not be. A single image at f16 even only shows the very tip of the antennae. And then you move to the base of the antennae, then the mandibles, then further and further back through the image. And then you put all of these slices together to make your final resultant image. And I can talk in detail about how to actually do that with Photoshop or Zareen Stacker, different software programs if people are interested in those kind of things. But now let's also talk about focal length. Again, with macro, probably 90% of my shooting I do with a single lens, my 105 millimeter macro lens. But you can do macro with all sorts of different focal lengths. And again, just broadly speaking about photography, focal length is important in sort of narrowing in or communicating a wide angle view of what you want to convey in the image. This is basically the same, mountain, just really zoomed in with a telephoto lens on the right or a wide angle lens on the left. And you can see they're radically different images. And you can use this in macro as well, especially now with the advent of the last couple of years of some better wide angle lenses that can actually focus very close, that have a minimum focus distance, MFD. Again, that's something I'll talk about in the equipment section to pay attention to when you're shopping for lenses. For example, this Laowa 15mm wide angle lens, you can focus on things right in front of the lens and actually produce a large enough image so that you can see detail in an insect while still getting a background, because the focal length is 15mm. Your field of view is very wide, versus a telephoto lens, which you can also use for macro, and that has the effect of zooming in and isolating your subject quite a bit. So this is really useful. I use this a lot for dragonflies, butterflies, things like that sometimes, especially anything that might be skittish or would be difficult to get very close to, but you want to magnify it. You can do that with a telephoto lens versus a shot that you could get with a wide angle lens, for example, where you can still focus close, but you can make out a lot of detail in the background. That's my mad scientist image. So MFD, minimum focus distance, is something that I recommend everybody pay attention to, especially if they're pricing, looking for new equipment or something like that, comparing different lenses. And that is on an SLR, it's measured from the sensor plane, which is indicated by this little circle with a hash mark through it. That's where my sensor is in this camera. And then the minimum focus distance is measured out from that. And for this lens, it's, I don't know, something like there, it's six inches or so in front of the lens, because I think it's listed as like 12 or 13 inches. But keep in mind that that's from the back of the sensor plane, not necessarily the front of the lens. Now with cell phones and with point and shoots, you're at kind of an advantage because these small little lenses on a cell phone or on a small point and shoot, they actually tend to be really good for wide angle macro photography. You have a small lens that you can get physically close to a subject, so your subject sort of looks bigger in comparison to the optics of the lens. So cell phones, point and shoots, they tend to have, actually the way the physics of the lens are constructed, they tend to have their shortest working distances at their wider focal lengths. So it's usually better for us with a cell phone macro not to zoom in too much, to stay kind of wide and just get physically closer. And you can tend to do that with point and shoots as well. That's a little bit the case with some SLR equipment that I can talk about, but we can go from there. But understanding this impacts what you should think about as far as lighting options and the behavior of the organisms that you're shooting. Again, if I'm shooting a very skittish butterfly that's out on some vegetation that I couldn't just walk to, it would scare it off. I might pull out a longer lens to try to get closer and isolate that way, versus going a wide angle lens and trying to physically get very close to it. There are some times where you can get really close to dragonflies or to other insects. This is another awesome shot from Nikki during a bug shot photography workshop. That's a workshop that I'll link to all you guys that I highly recommend. It's amazing being around a bunch of other insect photographers. This is one of the bug shots that they did in abroad. They do a couple international ones every so often. This was in Mozambique. And this dragonfly perched perfectly for Nikki to get physically close to this. But when I talk about working distance, one of the things you can see is the behind the scenes shot, how physically close he had to get to this dragonfly. That worked in this case. The dragonfly was very patient and cooperative. That might not always work with you. So you may want to think about that in terms of, say, if you want to buy a 105mm macro lens versus a 200mm macro lens. Might depend. If you shoot a lot of butterflies, I might recommend the 200 or a little bit longer focal length, for example. The other thing you can see sort of in this image is this big swath right here of diffusion material. So lighting, diffusing your flash especially, becomes very important in macro, and lighting in general is key to getting good macro shots. For cell phones and even for point and shoots, things like that, where you're just exposing with the ambient light, you don't really have much of an option to flash. Cell phones have a flash. It's usually really poorly positioned for macro. It's all the way on the corner or something like that. They're difficult to work with and to modify. So I tend to supplement cell phone lighting with a real bright flashlight or something like that. Occasionally I'll put that through a piece of just foam core diffusion material, is just packing foam, um, to really help spread the light out when you're shooting with your cell phone or something where you have a little bit less control of the light. You could also use these sort of LED panels. I'll pull one of these out right now. These can be really useful, especially for video lighting. This is a continuous source of light, so I could turn on this LED panel and leave it at varying brightnesses or varying depths. This one has a hot shoe connector. I can put it on top of my camera. And these can be really useful for video, which I'm not going to talk at all about today. But you can also do some modifications on those and have a continuous light source. If for nothing else, then to use as like a pre-focus light that just helps you line up the image and make sure you got focus correctly. You can also do that with these like ring flash lights that are popular for Instagrammers, but they make pretty nice lighting for macro. I'll talk a little bit more about ring lighting and specifically why I don't like ring lighting, but they work quite well even as a focus light. There used to be a way that a company that you could put an actual flash, a big speed light onto a hot shoe adapter that plugs into a cell phone audio jack. And you can actually use your cell phone but control a flash during the exposure. They don't seem like they make these anymore. I think that company went out of business. There might still be some of those kicking around, but that would be actually really interesting. That's something I haven't tried yet. But if you could control a flash that you could then modify or place in different areas, might be really interesting for cell phone. And then lighting for SLRs, you have a lot more options, a lot more expense as well, but a lot more options. One typical method is to purchase a speed light, like this Nikon speed light, which is $400 something. And then for macro, I highly recommend a Yongnuo, and I can link Amazon to one of these. It's like $70. And they work, for macro, they work exactly the same. You're really pretty much mostly in manual mode. You're shooting on a hot shoe through a diffusion. All you need is flash light. So these can work really well. Another option is to use one of these ideas for like a twin flash, either on the front of the camera right here, or something that plugs into the hot shoe that you can bend down and use. That's actually what I use, is my huge modified setup. Is a twin flash, individually movable flash heads with a little focus light that I've put some diffusion on, and then I also shoot through a white piece of plastic folder that tends to give me pretty creamy, pretty soft light wherever I need it. So I recommend this thing on the right called the Kwangren KX800. You can find it under a couple different brand names, but actually this thing in the middle I recommend as well. It's a Mikey unit called the SB400. No, I've completely forgotten what it's called, but I'll link it. It's a MEIKE brand twin flash that communicates with radio communication. The nice thing about that is you can pop off each of these individual flash heads if you want to move one around and light from the side or place it on the ground or anything like that. Nikon also makes a system much like this, but it's more expensive, and I used to use it for years, but it's more expensive and it runs off of infrared communication instead of a radio signal. So it's limited by line of sight. So if you put the flash behind a tree, it won't necessarily trigger. So I would highly much more recommend this Mikey unit, which is half the price and a lot better in a lot of other features. There's a lot of ways then that you could modify these flash brackets. There's a whole Facebook group called like DIY macro diffusers or something like that. Go ahead and go check that out. It's awesome. I mean, you could use a carton of milk, a jug of milk. I haven't used that technique yet, but there's lots of cheap ways of doing this, lots of ways that you can modify your own. And that's really what I recommend for people getting into lighting and trying to get bright color and flash onto their subject in a way that doesn't blow it out and have these glaring highlights that we kind of talked about right at the beginning. You really have to kind of adapt and modify your own sort of flash diffusion method, which can be a lot of fun. There is a company, this one in the middle top here, again, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but they actually make, these are a little more, you know, pre-built, and they fabricate and make these diffusers for specific flash types that they can mail out to you. Saves you the trouble of cutting up a Pringles can and trying to shove some packing foam in there. But that can be a lot of the fun of it too. Let's talk sort of lastly about composition before I get into some more visual examples of all these things. And composition is one of, there's many rules for composition. There's the rule of thirds. There's, you know, a rule of don't put things in the center of your image. And all those rules are kind of meant to be broken. But my thoughts about composition and how you can use it to make your image better is to just understand something about your viewer and what you're trying to communicate, making the image more evocative by placing some tension in the image, placing your critter to one side of the image, or the side that having some negative space at the side where the organism is looking, right? And you can, it starts to conjure up more imagery to the mind's eye. Now for humans, it's different if you're photographing for sharks or for birds or something like that. But for humans, our brain latches on to brightness and then to sharpness and then the rest of the image. So that's an important psychological concept to understand so that you can use that in your imagery. If you put the sun somewhere as the background of your image, that's where a viewer's eye is going to focus first, this white, bright spot in the background. Then they'll loop around the rest of the image. And composition for me is also in part about keeping your viewer engaged, keeping your viewer in the frame. There's lots of photos where you look at it and then your eye kind of wanders off and look at the next photo. But the really good photos, and you guys probably feel this anytime you've seen good photos or been to an art gallery, or you just, man, that's a great photo. Part of why that's a great photo is because you just can't stop looking at it. And you literally, your eyes will literally not be able to stop looking at it because you might have a bright spot that leads into a line that comes back and moves up this way because there's different color composition. We'll talk about all this that brings you right back to the subject, and you just can't turn away. So that's really, we're using composition to, you know, to its highest form. There are rules. These rules do help. Rule of thirds I use a lot. You want to divide your image into 9 squares, into thirds, top and bottom, left and right, and putting your subject in one of these sort of 4 PowerPoints of the images can be really helpful. It's just pleasing visually to the eye. You can use things like leading lines, the bend of a river, or a stick, a twig that's pointing towards your subject, and then it might be sitting on a rock that's pointing at the stick, and then the stick points back at your subject, and you just keep doing this. You just keep bouncing around the image. I always tell people as well to do border patrol on your images. It can be really easy to take this great image and you don't realize until later that there's a stick, you know, sticking right in from the side of the image, and it just sort of leads the eye out and away from the image. Those can be photoshopped out, but it's best if you can compose the image or pay attention to all the way around what goes into this rectangle of pixels that you call your photograph. So this image, for example, is a great description of composition, and I know where everybody's mind went, where everybody's eyes went right away as soon as I pegged over to this image, is right here. You can't, in this image, you cannot help but look anywhere but at the face of this orthopteran. This is one of Peter Niskrecki's shots. Amazing photographer. His lighting is just superb. So check him out as well. But what's really cool about this image is defensive display. You have all of these lines, but what they do is they all radiate from a single point. So your eye latches on to any single one of them and it just follows it right down to here. And then you go, whoa, look at that line, but it brings you down to here. All of these lines bring your eye right to the middle of the frame and you can't look away. You could also put a lubber grasshopper sort of down low in the image, and this is a wide angle macro where you're focused on the grasshopper, but he leads you out to this beautiful scene back here, and then you have some detail and sharpness in here that brings you to these lines on the ground that lead you back to the grasshopper, and again keeps you engaged in the frame. That's the sort of artistic, my artistic take on composition and how you, I would argue, you should use the rules of composition to improve your photography by just being cognizant of what do I really like about this image? What do I like to look at? What can I replicate on the next shot? I won't go through this at all. Again, this will be recorded on a video and you guys can stop and take a look at my thoughts about the costs and breakdowns, pluses and minuses of different types of equipment. But I'll go through and break down some sort of pros and cons for all of these. So cell phone cameras, the nicest thing about them is it's always with you. I always have my cell phone in my pocket, and it's way lighter. And I can't put this in my pocket. I've tried. I've found pockets that might be big enough, and it just doesn't work. So they're always with you. They're always connected. They're easy to carry. They have Wi-Fi, most of them, even if you're in the middle of a jungle or something, or at least you get back to Wi-Fi, you can upload your images immediately. You can view them and share them all around the world, post them on Facebook. It takes forever to get an image out of the SLR camera onto your computer, edit it, then send it up. And these can be, their best use, I would argue, is for wide angle macro or a little bit zoomed in, maximizing the features you can get out of the cell phone camera. The issues with them are that you have very little control, especially with the lighting. You have this limited focal range you can work with. It's difficult to do dragonfly that's far away, and just not a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can control. Again, especially the lighting, how you can best manipulate that. The little tips and tricks of just literally using a little piece of foam or even just your hand to shade and prevent a lot of these bright highlights and catch lights from going over your subject can be really, really helpful. And can at least give you something that you can work with or identify, again, use for identification purposes. One of my biggest gripes with cell phones, the lack of control, is how many people have a picture just like this beautiful, I tried to focus on this thing in the foreground and I got a beautiful picture of something 20 feet behind the image that I wanted to take, which is of this. I had some Asian citrusillid in my yard. You guys in Florida probably know all about ACP and how wonderful of a critter that is. But it's here in Southern California too, and I wanted to just document that it's in my yard. So I was trying to get this image, and the first image I shot was this image. And that's in part because I was not focused on the subject. It was difficult to lock focus when I'm just trying to snap an image. So one of the things that can really help, and I'll talk about some more tips like this, is sticking your hand like I've done here just behind the subject, just so it gives your cell phone something to lock onto. Some of the more advanced apps can actually allow you to control with like a slider the focus, and again, locking the focus can be critical to getting one of these. So those are my tips for cell phone macro. One of them is just to physically get closer. That tends to solve a lot of problems with any macro you're trying to do with cell phones. And to zoom in just a little bit, you don't want to zoom in all the way because then the minimum focus distance tends to jump to being much farther away than what you can focus on. So it's usually actually better to zoom back and then get physically closer. Again, that might not be possible with many hymenopterans or dragonflies, things like that. It's helpful if you can lock the focus point to find that focus, use your hand or something, find it, and then recompose by just kind of leaning in and out, taking a picture every so often, making sure that you've covered your bases to where you'll get one of those photos that's nailed. Especially if you can, again, pre-focus on something, your hand is always with you. And if it has one of those lock buttons on your slider, usually it's with the exposure slider, you can lock the focus and the exposure, and then you can take your cell phone anywhere and point it at anything. So it helps to pre-focus. I know that I have a bee that I want to get about this close to, because that'll be a nice size image in my cell phone. So I would pre-focus 6 inches from my hand, and then I would take my cell phone over and then go take a photo of the bee. Lighting, again, is key. It's difficult. You can't really use a flash in a lot of ways with cell phone macro, but something like a LED panel. This is a Neewer panel for, I don't know, $30 on Amazon. They're pretty easy to work with, pretty cheap. Any kind of big flashlight, again, especially through a diffusion material, can really help eliminate a lot of the bright highlights there. Clip-on lenses can work really well for macro. You guys have maybe bought these before or seen them being advertised. I've had a radical change in clip-on lenses since Nicky Bay recommended the one that he uses. There are lots of different ones you can do. There's ones with these like rubber bands or something. My advice still remains to, if you're using one of these, to pinch zoom in, to get physically close to your subject, rock back and forth. The thing with these is they tend to reduce your autofocus abilities on a cell phone camera. So it's best just to kind of lock focus. Otherwise, it just searches, and it's difficult when it's going through that much glass. And my recommendation used to be get the smallest one of these you can find, the ones that are like $6 from China on Amazon, because those had the greatest working distance. Some of the ones they sell are like 25x or 50x macro lenses, and they are good for photographing like snowflakes or grains of salt, but you would need to physically almost touch your organism. If it's like a bee, it's just going to fly away. But I have since started to fall in love with this macro lens specifically, and there are several like this now that are coming out. This one is called Apexel macro lens, and it's a 100mm macro lens. It comes with a little clip, and then the macro lens is a pretty big lens. Comes with a little cap and everything. But you can just put this, screw this onto your cell phone, clip it onto there. And the nice thing about this is it works a lot more like a typical SLR macro lens, where it gives you some zoom and some magnification, but it still gives you a good working distance. And that's been hard to do until I've seen lately some of these, something like this, where I would recommend, something that says like 100mm or like a true macro lens. They're not that bad, $30, and it comes in a little satchel thing that I can stick in my pocket or a backpack. And then I add to that a flashlight and a piece of diffusion material. And you can do some pretty decent shots with this. Again, there are a few other ones like this, but look for something that gives you a pretty good pretty good working distance. Look in the reviews for something like that. And one that can give you a pretty good, you don't need to zoom in much with this lens. And this works very similarly to an SLR setup. For example, you can still photograph jumping spiders with this. This, if you really pixel peep and you dissect it, this wouldn't hold up to large prints or anything like that. But for the web, for posting on Facebook, and for getting an identification or something like that, and just for having fun with it, this works great. This is an awesome little setup. This was taken with this setup, with this LED light right here, the macro lens clipped onto the cell phone with a piece of diffusion material, and a little setup for one of my jumping spiders that I have up here in my menagerie with the background behind it. So a little kind of studio shot, but these principles would also work in the field. And you can see with the light going through a diffusion material like this, you can see the catch light that would result right here in the eyes of this jumping spider, which is pretty pleasing and gives you kind of nice diffused lighting all over the top of the subject. Now you can do this exact same setup with your SLR camera, and obviously this is going to be a much sharper, much higher megapixel, much better exposure value across the image. In terms of it's a much higher quality image, but it's in principle the same kind of thing. And this image would stand up pretty well to a small web printer for a blog or something like that. And again, if you're doing science communication and writing a small blog, it's a heck of a lot easier to carry your cell phone around than it is to carry all this SLR equipment. Point and shoot cameras, I'm going to hardly talk about because I don't really use them. They can be a good backup, but the trouble they're facing is cell phone cameras now are so good these days, and SLRs are coming down in price as well. And like mirrorless SLR cameras, I can talk a little bit about that if people are interested. Those are coming down in price rapidly as well. So this is this kind of middle ground where they have more features of cell phones, but not as many as an SLR. So they're kind of in no man's land here right now. They are lighter weight, they're smaller, easier to carry. You can sling them around your shoulder. Great for travel or vacations, things like that. You do have some, usually like a macro setting, some control, some flexibility with what you're shooting. And again, they're sort of optimized. The physics of their lenses are optimized for sort of wider angle macro, which can be difficult for dragonflies, butterflies, some things like that. You do have usually a limited focal range, and because usually the lenses are built into the actual camera, you can't change them or swap them. There's limited flexibility in terms of add-ons you can put on, magnifiers or diopters. Some are compatible with that, or filters, things like that. You do have limited lighting options, but at least with a point and shoot, sometimes your flash is moved up in such a way where you can use it and diffuse it and make it look pleasing. But you also, one of the bigger things for me is the limited responsiveness. When I press my shutter down on this SLR camera, I pre-focus and then fire the shutter. That delay is like 0.03 of a second, something like that on this Nikon D500. So it's basically instantaneous. So if a jumping spider lifts its legs up for just a millisecond, I can capture that. It's harder with a point and shoot. I always have found you take the photo and then the camera thinks about it for 20 minutes and then it takes a photo and gives it back to you. They're getting better. And I can talk about some of the newer ones that actually, like some of the Nikons that are great for birding. They have like a 30x zoom range. You can photograph people on the moon and then also, your cousin's wedding. But they're really cool. So, but for me, SLR cameras are where it's at. And what I would encourage most people to get, if they're thinking about purchasing something to get into macro, I would absolutely recommend not spending, $10,000 on the newest, the biggest, fanciest SLR. You can get an older body, like a used SLR body that was manufactured 4 or 5 years ago. It might only be 16 megapixels, but that's going to be fantastic. It's going to have good dynamic range, and you get all the options of changing a lens, adding the lighting, and there's lots of sort of cheap ways to get into macro photography to at least get started. And I'll talk about some of that equipment here in a second. They're very responsive. You have full control. You can put them in full manual mode. The flexibility of having different lenses, like a dedicated macro lens, is really helpful. The image quality is outstanding for these, and you have lots of lighting options. But they are expensive. They're very heavy. One thing that kills me is these SLR cameras. Some of them are $7,000 just for the body now, and they still don't have Wi-Fi and integrated GPS. It's like, how difficult is that? Your cell phone has had GPS for like 15 years or whatever it's been. So I would love more manufacturers to start including GPS into their setups, into their SLRs, especially because sometimes I'll go on a trip and 6 years later I'll go, man, where did I find that spider species? I remember it was in a clay soil barren, but I in North Florida, but I don't remember exactly where. And that would be really useful to look back on. So I don't get it, but My recommendations for SLR equipment is to get a dedicated macro lens. Nikon is what I shoot, but Canon also or any manufacturer, and there's lots of third-party ones, Sigma, Tamron, all tend to make about 100 millimeter macro lens. The Tamron 90 millimeter macro lens is fantastic for like a third of the price of any of the Nikon ones. This is the Nikon 105. The Canon MP65 is a great lens for this. Starts at I think 2.5 magnification and goes to 5, or 2 magnification goes to 5x magnification. Or no, sorry, this one starts at 1x, goes to 5x. So this is for photographing like Collembola or tiny little wasps, things like that. And it can work really well, but it can be a difficult beast to manage. So I might not recommend this for the very first time shooters, unless you are studying trichogramma and that's your thing and you want to get photos of those guys. This is the way to go. Although Laowa, again, is this new company that's starting to make some really good quality stuff. They also have a 2.5 to 5x highly zoomed in. This is basically like shooting with a microscope adapter on the front of your lens. But both very, very good cameras. Yeah, that's the Laowa 25 millimeter ultra macro. But probably the lens I would recommend for most people, just especially getting into macrophotography or anyone into macrophotography right now, would be this Laowa, oh, that should say 100 millimeter. This is a f2.8 lens, but it captures from infinity to 2x. So what's really nice is in this one lens, you can photograph a person standing 10 feet away from you, but you can also photograph a small butterfly, and then you could even go further and photograph a thrip that's on the butterfly. And what's nice is you can do this all with one lens. This lens doesn't have autofocus, but in every other aspect, it's fantastic. The image quality is amazing, and it's like $450 or $500 compared to $900 or $1,000 for most of the name brand first party lenses. So I highly recommend this one currently. This is probably the best one on the market. You can also do things like adding a diopter. So if you already have some equipment and you want to get a closer shot of, say, a small jumping spider or a really small parasitic wasp, you might be able to do that just with one of these diopters. This is a Raynox diopter, and it's just like basically screwing a magnifying lens onto the front of your camera. They come with this little clip thing, but I recommend if you get one to get a threading ring that is the same thread as the front of your SLR. And then this is the actual lens part right here, and you can see it's just basically like a magnifying glass. But having it threaded allows you to just thread it right onto the front, screws right onto the front of your camera. And then for virtually no added weight, no effect on autofocus, anything like that, I can now focus much closer, and it just magnifies the power basically of the Nikon 105 lens. You could also do this by adding extension tubes behind the lens, between the lens and the camera, and this helps, basically works on the physics of how the light refracts and bends onto your focal plane to push that push the physics of the light further away from the sensor, which allows you to get a closer minimum focus distance. So this similar kind of thing. And you can use both of these in conjunction to get really close. You could use a bellows system. A bellows is basically an adjustable version of these rings that you can just stack behind. You can get those on a slider rail or something like that. Another thing to do, that if you have an SLR knocking around, or you want to buy one, if you only have $200 to spend on this, get a cheap $100 SLR body from 10 years ago. They're easy to find on eBay, ones that are taking up storage in the garage. Get a cheap lens, like just a fixed 50 millimeter prime lens or an 18 to 55 kit zoom lens. Lots of those for cheap on eBay, maybe $30. And then get a reverse ring, a reverse mount ring. And they make them specifically for your specific camera body. What this is you can screw your lens onto this ring, and you flip the whole thing around backwards and mount it to your lens body or your camera body. And it's just like if you guys have taken binoculars and flipped them around. If you look through a binoculars backwards, they basically become a magnifying glass, and you can get really close up looks at insects on the ground, things like that. You're doing a similar thing here, reversing the optics, and you can actually get 2x zoom and get some really just fantastic shots with this. This is a setup that Nash Turley, if that's a name that's familiar to you guys, has used. He spent some time in Florida, and I think he still predominantly uses this. I don't think he's really bought any more equipment. Thomas Shahan is another very famous macro photographer that now has some other equipment, but has taken most of his shots with just a reverse or a relay lens setup. Again, for SLRs, you can then add the lighting, which I would highly recommend any of these options. The twin flashes give you some more flexibility. Although again, for a Yongnuo speed light, you can get that for like $70. These are maybe $200, $250. And again, it really helps if you spend time messing with your lighting options and trying to get the best diffusion that you can out of that. So with those sort of options covered, I want to talk about just some last tips that can hopefully help you just take better photos. And this works for any equipment, really any subject that you're photographing. It helps to maximize your equipment for what you're trying to photograph. But these tips are universal across everything and will hopefully help you guys take better macro photos. My biggest tip I always give people is to know your subject. The subject is everything in your photograph, and knowing not only what your subject is prone to do, but what is unique about your subject, what would make for an interesting or compelling photograph because it's your subject, why is that subject of interest, but also, again, the behavior of your subject, how can you predict when and where your subject will be, can be really important to generating a photo. The shot of a jumping spider, for example, I set up with a laser beam tripwire across the plane that this spider was going to jump, but I had to set it up in such a way and cajole the spider in such a way that it would get to the end of the stick, turn around and look at the other stick on the opposite side and jump that way. And I could get it to where I could get a repeatable result of him jumping across this gap. And it made getting the photo a lot easier if I knew to predict that behavior, that motion. Another subject that can be difficult to capture without being sort of pre-aware of what's going to happen is, for example, this mosquito emerging from its aquatic habitat, from its pupal case, it's pupating out. To get this image, I had to get a bunch of mosquito pupa and put them in a little tub, and I shot low down, eye level with the tub with a background behind it. And I had to sit there and wait, but I got mosquito pupa that were very close to emerging, and I watched them, and it took me like, 100 tries or something, 100 different pupa before I started recognizing, okay, the darker ones that are moving in this way, those are ones that might be about 10, 15 minutes from pupating, getting the temperature right, getting the setup right. And it just took patience and learning more about when is it actually going to emerge. And then I was able to find one that was in the process of emerging to take this photo. So that's really important. Another very important, let me just check the chat here. Everybody good? Yep. Another very important aspect to this is knowing your equipment. And I say knowing your equipment mostly so that you can go from having your equipment be this complex thing of what does it mean if I'm in landscape mode or auto flash off, what does that mean? What do all these settings on the dial mean? What does it mean if I'm in close up versus programmed auto exposure mode? Reading through your manuals, getting familiar with your equipment so that you can forget, what are all these settings, so that you can forget any or all of this. I'm gonna not even put that up there because it's too complicated to even bother looking with. But my advice is to understand and know your camera intimately so that you can forget it. So that all I'm focused on when I'm photographing a jumping spider is watching the jumping spider's behavior when it's ready to make that leap, or when it's going to pounce on a prey item, or again, an interaction with two dragonflies come in close and I want to photograph them when they're interacting with each other. My whole attention is focused on the dragonflies interacting. If I know that I've got all my settings dialed in, I know that my focus is where it needs to be. I know how to work the camera just fine. So know your equipment so that you can forget all of that and just focus on documenting the subject. Um, Another tip, especially for macro, especially with the big heavy SLR, but even with cell phones, is proper hand-holding technique. And I see a lot of folks with SLRs that tend to hold them like this. This works okay, but you're a much more stable position if you can get underneath and keep your arms coupled to your body when you're shooting, especially when we're dealing with macro, which is a long focal length, a very short depth of field, and you're just hunting. A lot of folks that have tried macro photography, it can be so difficult to hunt and find your subject, and the focus keeps racking in and out. So it really helps if you're very stable and pointed at your subject and try to make yourself a tripod. You could actually shoot from a tripod, and this is helpful for flower photography or something like that, where your subject doesn't move. A little more difficult with, you know, with macro, with a spider running around or something like that. But they do make little ground pods or things like that that can just help you, give you some stability. Instead of buying one of those, though, what I do is I just fill a Ziploc bag full of sand or dirt or something like that, and then you can set your camera on that. You can kind of adjust your camera, and this can be helpful when taking like a long exposure, but that you then want to have your subject in and maybe get the sunset in the background or something like that. You need a longer exposure. It helps to just keep your camera more stable on the ground or on a platform. I would highly recommend, especially more for wildlife photography, long lens and birds and things like that, that you guys check out Moose Peterson. He has a whole sharpness series on how to best hold the camera, how to best optimize your settings on the camera to get the sharpest image. But for macro, it's more really about just being a stable platform so that you're less frustrated. And again, all of these tips are so that you can focus on the subject and you can get the best shot of the subject. Getting closer is a really good tip that will improve a lot of your photography, especially for the more evocative, like the artistic part of photography. It's one thing to get a record image of a subject, but if you keep working the image, work around, get a little bit closer, you can then get this more interesting, more intimate sort of portrait. And this works for anything. You can get a spider where this is like barely identifiable that it's a spider, to here where you know it's a wolf spider, and you can upload that to iNaturalist, and that's a great record shot. That's actually quite a in sharp, pretty well exposed photo, all that. But while it wouldn't make for a very good record photo, it makes for a much more dynamic and evocative photo if you do something like this with a wolf spider, where you really get up close and personal. Sorry for the arachnophobes out there, but this just makes a cool image. Um, Another thing that really heightens the viewer's interest in your image and the passions, the emotion, the pulling at heartstrings, is if you can get some interactions in your photos. I was really lucky that this Pellini's jumping spider, um, the rock I was photographing it on had a little hemipteran nymph that wandered too close, and this guy pounced on him, and then it just made this cool shot because now you can see he's engaging in predation. You can see the actual the prey item, the antennae on it. You can see him sitting there eating it. It's just a even a cooler shot than just a portrait alone would be. And this works for any aspect of your subject's biology that you want to document, especially when you're doing science communication, say for a paper that you're producing that you just wrote that you're publishing, and they ask for either like a video abstract or a visual abstract. This is getting more common a lot of cases, which I love. It's this can really put into perspective what you're trying to communicate about your study visually, and it helps to have photos of those parts of the subject's biology that is interesting, and focusing on how to produce an image of that. Again, composition, finding a good dynamic composition here. This is another great macro photographer up in Canada who photographs other things too. But you can see in this photo of a chipmunk, there's a very white, bright spot in the eye that your eye is kind of drawn to. You go down the tail, maybe you come back over here. Here's a stick that leads you right back to the squirrel. And again, we talked about keeping the viewer inside your frame instead of going out of the frame. And another thing that I'll talk about with a lot of visual examples here is learning to see light, and especially learning to control, like we talked about at the very beginning, some highlights and a lot of the specular, a lot of that harsh contrastiness in an image. This can be really helpful, for example, on shiny ants, going from a situation where you have these two bright hotspot lights to a more diffused, even lighting covering the whole subject and illuminating things evenly without blowing out any areas where you lose detail. I'll walk you through sort of the equipment of how the equipment can make a big impact to this. If you just use a bare flash on your camera, you're going to get a very small, very bright source of light that ends up with a very bright sort of highlight in your spider. Say this is jumping spider. If you just put that flash through a little bit of diffusion, this is another Amazon product I can link to folks. It just clips onto the front of the lens and folds up, tucks into your pocket. And this can be a really great lightweight companion for just going around. You know, if you're in Panama or something, don't have a lot of equipment to bring. This can make quite a good improvement to the catch light, to the harshness of the shadows. These shadows are much more soft and diffused, and it looks much more like a cloudy day than here where it's a bright, harsh point source of light. You could then even do a setup like I have right over here, a big white box setup where you're bouncing flash into this huge box, and you end up getting very soft, very even diffused light. And you can see this, especially jumping spiders make unforgiving but very good subjects to practice on because you can see in their eyes the results of your diffusion. So a small, bright point source of light is going to result in harsh lighting, very sharp and strong shadows, very well-defined shadows. We tend to like diffusing that light, making everything more even and evening out the shadows, evening out the illumination. And you can see in the catch light of this jumping spider, well, same jumping spider, just with this lighting setup, you get a lot more surface area. It's more spread out over the surface of your subject. And then you can see the catch light in a white box studio. It's a little bit artificial, but it does provide nice even illumination. You can do this in the field. This is a setup I typically use in the field, which would result in these two bright point source catch lights, but you could then diffuse that through a piece of plastic folder to get a more even illumination. And you could soften that even further by adding some, foam packing to the flash heads and then diffusing that through your subject. And you can see in the eyes of these spiders, you go from very bright point sources of light to a much more diffused light source, but you can still kind of see two catch lights there, to a much more diffused, soft, even light. So that's what I would recommend folks really push for, especially if you get into SLR macro photography. The lighting is so important. Balancing the lighting with what we talked about with ambient exposure, and I can give you guys recipes for tending to get good images. Most of my stuff is at f16, 1/250th of a second, or whatever the fastest sync speed that your camera's shutter is with the flash, and I can talk about that if anybody has questions. And then using maybe quarter power flash that you diffuse and really evenly illuminate your subject, and you can get splendid results with pretty minimal sort of effort or complexity You just literally throw some foam right in front of your flash, and it tends to work pretty well. Let me see if we just had a chat window. Oh yeah, to the packing foam. Yeah, I will. I'll link that as well in the chat here. Whoops. Go back. There you go. Yeah, I bought it off Amazon for $12, and it's like packing foam that you use to put in between plates and stuff like that for when you're shipping. Or just anything you get in the Amazon box that you order your lens in. Go ahead and use that as well. But there's lots of options. So here's the last thing I want to go through is again another example of working your way through an image and going from getting pretty bad image that I'll show you to a much better image. This isn't great by any means, but it's a much better image after I spent some time working my way through it. This image was taken with this camera, the D500, and a big, huge telephoto lens that doesn't have a lot of business being a macro lens. This is what I use for bird photography and wildlife, stuff like that. It's 200 to 500 lens, but it's kind of what I had on me at the time. But I usually always carry some components that allow me to take macro with that setup. So the first image that I took just with the body and this lens, which can't focus very close, was this. It's not very well lit. It's sort of too far away. So I knew I wanted to get closer and to add some light to the situation. So I whipped out a flash. This is that Yongnuo one I talked about that I highly recommend those because they're cheap and they work fine. Put it in manual mode, and I knew I just needed to go from this to adding some flash, some brightness, some color, and you can actually make out better the markings and the sort of detail all throughout the body of this damselfly. But I also knew I needed to go closer. So then I added, I think I had a two-part extension tube just to get my working distance physically that much closer to be able to basically magnify or focus closer on the subject so that it would appear larger in my camera. And so I went from this image with flash to now just being able to get physically closer and resolve even more of that detail across the whole spectrum. And then I wanted to push the image a little bit further and get a more pleasing background, shoot it from the side to where I could get everything in focus in one band of focus, and I ended up with this image. So it's that process of trying to work your way through going from an image that's a not very good image, and I have tons of these, but working, using the equipment, using the lighting, using the composition and understanding of the background to where I get a much better, more isolated, more beautiful picture that you can resolve a lot of detail in. And I tried to especially highlight a lot of this detail so that I could put it on a naturalist and try to get an identification of one of these critters. So that's one example of working your way through an image, going from taking a photograph to really making and working an image and making a photograph that's a lot more pleasing to the eye, a lot more detail, a lot more evocative, which helps a lot in anything from science communication to just your own interest and your own joy of getting better quality and better detail and lighting in all your photographs. So yeah, that's most of what I wanted to cover today. We can talk about some questions. I can talk a little bit more about specifics of specimen photography, putting things on a standard background, color calibration. There's tons of stuff we get into. But I hope this kind of gave you some idea of just the different components involved, the different ways that you can do macro pretty cheaply, lots of different equipment, and ways that we can go from there. So I can do sort of a question and answer session. I have a couple other tips and things I could share as well. You can always, we've spent way more than enough time here already for you guys, but you can find me at my website or on Facebook. I don't really go on Instagram, but I have these accounts if you're interested. I'm getting more active on Twitter. But you can also directly email me if anyone's interested about workshops that I teach, or again, other videos and tips and tricks and stuff that I have there. I'll link both this video, assuming it recorded correctly and turns out okay, and a video from a while ago here in this chat. And again, I can link some product descriptions from Amazon, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we can, I'll check the chat if anybody, there you go, if anybody has something. And if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, go ahead. I'll read this chat question here, talk about flash syncing, how it works, what settings I would suggest. Okay, let me talk about that a little bit. Yeah, so I mentioned, this from Amaro, I mentioned a little bit about my settings for most of the shots that I shoot being about 1/250th of a second exposure and f16, something like that. And the reason that I do that is, well, you can control, sometimes if I have a brighter background or something, or I want to bring out some detail in the background, I might lower that shutter speed to 1/60th or 1/10 of a second, or even like 2 seconds or something like that to suck in a lot of ambient light, and then I'll hit the flash. So there's a couple things going on there. I always shoot my flash in rear curtain sync mode, and that tells the camera to fire the flash at the end of the exposure instead of the beginning of the exposure. So that's in case I do have something where I have like a 2-second exposure. Any motion or ambient light that I bring into the frame will then, the sharpest part of the image will be exposed when the flash hits. So all of that motion will be behind the subject when my flash hits. So that's where you get streaking or something like that, ghosting. But I want that to be behind the subject if I ever do. So if I do drag the shutter like that, I'll go in rear curtain sync. But the sort of more important point is the syncing of the actual flash with the shutter. What happens, the shutter moves across your sensor plane like this. You have a bottom curtain that goes down, and then a top curtain that comes down, and then it closes up. And that length of that opening moving across your shutter, your sensor plane, is what determines the length of your exposure. Now with flash, the flash has to fire and time itself so that it fires when that little slit is open and moving across your sensor plane. What happens if you fire your flash at too high of a shutter speed, like something like 1,000th of a second? That's too quick for the flash to fire and expose the image. So you end up with dark bands across your image, which is actually the shutter blades. So you may have had that happen if you used a higher shutter speed. With the Nikon D500, this specific camera, its max sync speed is 1/250th of a second, actually 1/320th if I do some other settings. But many cameras, it's about a 200th of a second. So I would recommend shooting at or around a 200th, maybe a 1/60th, because then you're fast enough exposure that you're not really getting any ghosting, but you're slow enough that your flash can expose the entirety of the image without blocking itself out, if that makes sense. There is also a thing called high speed sync, and you can use that. What that does is it allows the flash to fire multiple times during that shutter passing over your sensor plane, but only certain brands and types of flash can do that. The actual speedlight flash can do that. And those tend to be the more expensive ones. That's useful for when you really have to expose at 1/1000th of a second, like for bird photography or things like that. And I actually, I use a high speed sync flash for my bird photography, which is this Heosin Speedlight HF582. It's a cheap flash that specifically can do high speed sync. So this is what I use for taking photos of something where I need 1,000th of a shutter speed, thousandths of a second, but I want to add flash to brighten up. Say it's got a really bright background behind this bird, but the bird is in the shade of a tree, and I need to fill flash it. So not so much useful for macro. We're so physically close to the subject that our flash tends to illuminate the entire photo, background and subject, everything. There are situations where you have to balance that a little bit. and there you can drag your shutter speed a little bit. But for the most part, I would recommend the maximum setting of your camera, the maximum sync speed with the flash, which is usually 1/200th of a second. I've got another question in the chat. Okay, yeah, ghosting using flash in sunlit areas. Yeah, and shading can make the subject fly away. Exactly, and that's I didn't even read that, but that's kind of what I just talked about in terms of using using a faster shutter speed up to the maximum that your flash can sync, and then also using a higher f-stop. If you're really getting a lot of bright background light coming in, you want to narrow that aperture as much as you can. Maybe go up to f18 or 22, assuming diffraction is not too much of a problem. But even in the brightest sunlight, you can usually get away with something like 2/50th and something like f16, especially if you have your flash set on such a power that you're dominating the exposure with the flash. So if you take a test shot, and that's one good thing to do, is turn off your flash and take a test shot, and you want to get it to where the test shot, the background is pretty dark, almost nothing is exposed. Then you know that the entirety of the exposure is coming from your flash, and then the flash will tend to freeze any motion that you get in your subject. There's intricacies with that as well that I won't get into. But basically, I would recommend a little bit higher flash power and a little bit darkening your exposure, without talking about the flash. So by upping your shutter speed a little bit, or upping your aperture number, closing down your aperture a little bit. Shading really can help, and if you can orient yourself in such a way, or even if the subject is in sunlight, but you can at least get the background to where it's in shade, you might rotate around, or if it cooperates, you can grab the branch and kind of bend it down or something like that. You have to be careful with a lot of small insects that can fly. But yeah, those are some of the tips that I would say, especially dominating your exposure with the flash will help freeze a lot of that motion. So yeah, and again, I'll link the packing foam and all that kind of stuff. Does anybody have a question on the Zoom whatevers? Let me go out of here. No? Okay, I've stopped sharing. Okay, I think I'm figuring this out. Okay, all righty. Well, thank you guys. That's all I really wanted to cover. So as I say, if anybody has any further questions or anything like that, feel free to reach me in the chat or send me an email. I got some more chats. Max, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Oh no, I was just gonna say thank you for coming to speak.
Oh,
Yes,
excellent.
thank
Yeah, of
you so
course.
much,
You're
Effie.
very welcome. And again, I can chat more with you, or we can do it offline, specifically about microscope photography. I didn't really talk at all about that. But yeah, using a specific, that kind of specific equipment, again, we might want to think about ways you can diffuse the flash, ways you can, or the lighting in there, and ways you can kind of snoot it and get it in such a way to reduce some of that glare.
Yeah, your presentation gave me some ideas. Thank you.
Good, excellent. Try some things out, and if you have any issues with it or something, feel free to shoot me an email, or feel free to do a Zoom chat, and we can. One of the nice things with Zoom, if you can physically be there working with stuff, or showing examples of your photography, is really helpful too. To somebody that's a photographer, can help you with the lighting or whatever. Having some examples of like what you don't like the very beginning of my presentation, I had some bad photos, and we worked through, like that last damselfly photo. I hope I conveyed that you can work through in specific ways that help enhance specific parts of your photography that you don't like or that you want to correct. So having the bad photos, having the good examples of like, oh man, this sucks, but I don't know why it sucks, or what can I do about this specific problem, can really help. And just go at it, experiment and target. I have a folder on my computer. Every year I make a new folder for photography, like experiments, and just lighting experiments, and I try different lighting from the side, lighting from the top. It was particularly hard with aquatic stuff that I'm photographing through an aquarium, getting the lighting from the side or instead of directly on. One big thing with reflections is angle of incident equals angle of reflection. So if you have your light source coming in and hitting the glass of an aquarium and then it comes right back into the lens axis, you're going to get these bright flares of light and stuff. So it helps to move the lighting up or off to the side or something like that, where your angle coming in doesn't, most of that light doesn't directly hit the lens axis. That can be something to help reduce those glares, and just play around and, just make some notes about what you like or don't like, or go, oh, I diffused the light and it made it look this way, or I, did angled the light this way and I really like that result. And that's something you can keep building off of. So cool. Good.
Thank you so much.
Of course, you guys are very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone goes out, and I hope it's good weather out there in Florida for you guys to take some cool photos of stuff. Oh, mite photography from Suzanne. Suzanne, who photographs mites. Yes, mites are extremely, extremely difficult. So yeah, maybe we should talk about we should get together and do a microscope session, because those can be yes, Suzanne. Yeah, I'll put some links in the chat to some more of that as well. So cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you guys for having me. So actually what I'll do is let me put some links in here right now before ending, because I don't know if I can, rediscover this chat thread. But then I'll put my email in here as well. And that's probably the best way to get directly in touch with me if you have any specific questions on lighting and things like that. So yeah, I'll be here for the next, I don't know, 15 minutes, just linking various bits of equipment and stuff in this chat window right down there. But yeah, so feel free to log off or whatever if anybody needs to.
And for
We'll go from
anyone who
there.
doesn't know, there's a way to save the chats.
Ah,
In the chat box, if you go down next to where it says file, you can click the three dots and press save chat, and it will save it to the file on your computer.
excellent. Okay. And what I'll do right now is I'll link my YouTube video, that one that I did the other month, and then as soon as I figure out how to save this file, I'll go ahead and have that available to somebody, in the either in the chat, or I'll put it up on YouTube and people can email me or go to my YouTube channel to see it from there. Or I'll send it to you guys, and if you can spread it around the Entomological Society of Central Florida, we'll go from there.
Yep, no problem. I'll do that.
All righty. Well, thank you guys. So yeah, chime in if you have any questions. If not, go enjoy photographing, and I'll just be linking some things here. And see if I can find some more of that. There you go. All right. So here is basically the same talk. If anybody wants to go watch that. Oh, whoops, I just sent that just to Max. Let's try that again. Everybody. Okay. So there you go.
I made the same mistake earlier. Like I tried to respond to Suzanne, but
Oh,
actually,
yeah, I'm so useless with this stuff, but there you go. Oh yeah, yep. Okay, let's find some packing foam. And I just literally got yeah. Oh, here you go. I think I got
yeah, I was respond because she had
this one.
like, oh, is Max doing microscope photos? Like, I've been doing them for years. I was like, oh, nice, yeah, I am.
That's awesome. Suzanne is great. She's been on a lot of the bug shot workshops. I don't know if y'all know each other previously to this, but she's another person that can help tremendously. She's a phenomenal photographer, and a lot of the folks that have done the bug shot workshops have gone through a lot of boot camp training on how to light and how to change different things around. In fact, let me make sure I link to the bug shot workshop. especially because the next workshop, assuming the pandemic is at least a little better under control by sort of midsummer, usually it's around June. That is that link there, bugshot.net. That's a phenomenal set of workshops, usually with John Abbott and then Alex Wild, who's a name everybody knows. I'm sure everybody's used one of Alex's photos in any presentation they've ever given on insects. And then usually either Thomas Shahan, Peter Niskrecki, Nikki Bay, Jenna Johnson. She's another phenomenal photographer based in Georgia, pretty close to y'all. There's a Facebook group for Bugshot as well that is really helpful and really just about, again, if anybody has questions or how do I get into this, how do I light this, is this a good lens, all that kind of stuff. That group is really useful, and I'll link their Facebook page there. There's a number of Facebook groups, different, as I say, that DIY macro one is really good. Just this foam packaging that I linked on this this huge Amazon link, is just any example of any random one. That was literally the first one that popped up. But anything that's just, I have like these plates of, they're this like big, they come in this size plates of, I guess you literally put like dinner plates on them when you're packing to go to move, which probably explains why all my dinner plates are broken. But yeah, this works pretty well. You can see it diffuses light, pretty well. Another thing that works real well is actual diffusion paper. They make an actual like paper that is used on softboxes or in studio lighting for professional lighting equipment. And they make rolls of this stuff. One of the brands that I highly recommend is called Roscoe Lux. And I'll just type that in here. Roscoe Lux diffusion paper. That's another, they sell that at B&H Photography or Adorama or stuff like that. And that stuff works really well. You can get that in varying stops of how much light it scatters and diffuses. And like the 10 stop stuff, I mean, it's like just a sheet, like a white sheet of paper. You can't get any light through it. But you can layer multiple levels of that if you need, and make your own kind of DIY assemblage of stuff like that. So, oh, excellent. Somebody actually does photograph columbilans. Good. Columbilans are stunning when you actually get up close to them, but it can be difficult. From Christy, do I ever use a teleconverter with the Nikon 105? I don't, only because I don't own one, but that's one of my next purchases that I'd like to do. And I have used them before. The Nikon 105 can take the Nikon ones, and other ones can take them. So a teleconverter, what that is basically a little magnifying glass that you put in between your lens and the camera body. And it's like a doubler. You could get like a 2x teleconverter or a 1.4x teleconverter. And those can actually be really useful with the 105, yeah, but more with like a 70 to 200 lens that you then also add extension tubes to, and make sure you put the extension tubes, on the appropriate side of the teleconverter. Usually that's it goes teleconverter, then extension tubes, then your 70 to 200 lens, but it might depend on the manufacturer, so you don't scratch the glass as you're screwing them in. But something like a medium telephoto, or even like a 200 macro lens or something like that, what really helps there is then you have this small compact package that you use a teleconverter to get a little more zoom, but you add the extension tubes to still retain a small minimum focus distance. And that's that's like a really optimum amount of zoom for your image size in the camera for things like dragonflies and damselflies especially. It gives you something like 5 to 10 feet of working distance, which is perfect if you come down to like the shore of a river and there's a bunch of vegetation and then a damselfly, and you don't want to like disturb the vegetation, it'll shoot off. And what I usually then, if I'm using a teleconverter, you know, say with wildlife, it becomes more like bird or wildlife photography, where what I'll usually do there is I'll just put the bare flash right into my hot shoe, or what I'll even do, and just aim it sort of down. And what I'll even do is I'll put a little extension here. They make some little hot shoe risers that you can put just to get, again, because that angle, the angle of flash incident equals the angle of reflection. And I don't want to get a lot of bright highlights. I want to just kind of feather the flash over my subject. So I might raise this up, and I might just angle the flash a little bit off, or a little bit, so it just kind of scatters over it. Because when you're dealing with something that's 10 feet away, it's difficult to, I mean, you can't really diffuse the flash like you can when your subject is this close. If your subject is this close, you can use a whole sheet of diffusion paper, and that light just becomes like 100 times bigger than your small jumping spider or something like that. But when your point source is 10 feet away from a dragonfly, that becomes a lot more difficult. So I tend to use just straight flash right out of the camera, sometimes with a better beamer or something like a Fresnel element that extends or magnifies your flash. Yeah, so teleconverter can work. With the 105, it's pretty useful, but probably more useful teleconverters in comparison to like a Raynox filter. You might get the same image size, but the Raynox does that by shortening your working distance, which can be good or bad. Whereas a teleconverter does that just by sort of magnifying the image, so giving functionally the same working distance as you would without the teleconverter. So that's when it can be useful, especially for like skittish creatures, or if it's physically difficult to get close to your subject. Maybe they're a subject that's on the ground and you can't get low enough or close enough, or something like that. So yeah, good recommendations, good discussions. I think that's most of the things I wanted to link. Did I miss something of equipment or? Yeah. As I say, I'm happy to work on those. Oh, the clip-on light. Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, that one is, or the clip-on lens that I have. It's an apexel macro, and let me link. Okay, this is the one. Yeah, I think this is the one that I specifically use. As recommended by Nicky Bay, he has a whole series on his website, which is singaporemacrophotography.com or something like that. Just Google Nicky Bay macrophotography. And he has a whole blog post on his website of using this to photograph shrimp in his aquarium. He has a freshwater shrimp aquarium. And that's actually really really interesting, because he talks some about the lighting as well, and how to best optimize things like that. Oh no, S9. Yeah, you might be able to jerry rig something together, but I would look for something like that. That's like a dedicated macro lens. This is the clip that it comes with, and yeah, it's not necessarily. Where's the, yeah? It's only sort of about that long, so it works okay on my. This is a Google Pixel, and so it goes on like that way, and then you actually screw the lens into this. So the nice thing with it is it can, the part where you screw the lens in, I'll take it off, you can probably see that better. The part where you screw the lens in actually can like slide up and down like that. So it can fit over the housing, over where your lens is. So it might not work on every camera. It sounds like it doesn't work on the S9. But hopefully there's something that, I would look for something that's similar to this. And again, the nice thing about that is this lens is, that's the actual lens. So you could possibly do a DIY, mount something on it. I don't know how much welding experience you have, Suzanne. You could put it on something like that possibly, but I'll look for some other things like that and talk about that as well. So yeah, so there you go. So for microscope macro photography, there's a few other things to consider. Mostly it's sort of the equipment that you're actually, it's very equipment specific. So that's the one thing I didn't really talk about here. You can do things like SEM photography. You can do, I've used the USB cameras and they tend to suck. And I've used the mounts that you can actually mount your SLR to, and they're a little better. But the biggest thing is usually most microscope photos or most of the photography setups, they work with this like small ring light that's a very bright, small point source of light. And so the biggest thing is sort of diffusing that, either just disabling that light and adding your own from the sides or from somewhere to diffuse them around. Something like one of these LED panels is a much bigger source of light than the small little ring flash that's a very bright light, and then adding some packing foam or diffusion or something like that. Again, you can shoot the you can shoot this, which already has a diffuser on it, through the packing foam, and you go from either a bright source light to now, and especially if I, you know, it's hard to tell. I might need more layers of foam, but you can then light up this entire surface area, and you go from a smaller surface area to a larger surface area. And that's the key for lighting. Softer light comes from being closer and being bigger. So the closer and bigger you get, the softer you can do. So, oh yeah, Alan Walls. That's a really interesting, some really interesting YouTube stuff. There's tons of stuff on YouTube that can absolutely help. Dynalight USB scope. Oh, cool. That or UBD scope that does photo stacking. That's another thing. A lot of the cameras now, especially the mirrorless cameras, Olympus pioneered some of this. Some of the Sony cameras, they can do focus stacking in the camera body, and a lot of the USB scopes, the microscope cameras as well, that you actually mount onto a microscope. And that can really help because, again, with a microscope, usually, especially if you're doing like soil organisms or small, hymenopterans or stuff like that, you're really talking like the magnification is such that your sliver of focus, your band of focus is so small that stacking really helps. And you can either do that on a stacking rig, or a lot of these new programs are coming out with inbuilt focus stacking, or these SLRs that can be really helpful. I say SLRs, but it's usually, I think it's almost entirely mirrorless cameras that do this now, because they have electronic apertures and they can just rattle off like 60 frames in a second and take the 30 of them to stack an image together. And that can be really useful. So you can focus stack by hand or through a Photoshop or something like that. And I could talk a little bit about that, but the technology is really improving a lot. But it's still, I would say, lighting is getting the lighting to really be even is a good way to do it. Yeah, IKEA lights, gooseneck lights. Yeah, those can really help. You can even just the lighting your scope came with, if it's one of those gooseneck things, just literally like stick a piece of I make these little things out of packing foam and just like tape that onto the end of your light, and then it at least brightens that surface area a little bit. You lose power doing that, but again, usually most microscope lights are powerful enough that that's not a problem. Or you can bring it up with ISO settings on your cameras or stuff like that. So yeah, the Olympus stuff is like insane, off the planet. So yeah, focus bracketing, and so that's so cool. That's so freaking cool. Nikon, I swear, is like, I love Nikon. I happen to shoot Nikon from the start of my shooting, and I really like their designs. I really like the way these cameras feel in your hand, and the sort of design and the functionality of these cameras. But in terms of like features, even they're on their second generation of mirrorless cameras now, and they don't do half the things that like the first generation of Olympus mirrorless cameras did 5+ years ago. So if you're listening, Nikon, step up your game a little bit. But again, for most of any of the shots that you saw that I took in this presentation, I bet you could do any of those. Maybe the laser tripwire system you need to have the actual setup, but all the other shots you could take with $200 of equipment. Get a cheap SLR body, get a reverse ring and a small flash and some packing foam, and focus more on the quality of the light and the quality of the composition and the pictures, the color balance, all that kind of stuff makes such a big difference compared to buying the latest and greatest thing. And I would really recommend that if you're going to spend money, spend it on lenses. Those are always a good investment. But also, if you're going to spend money, spend your money in terms of buying time. So either spend your money on a vacation somewhere where you can photograph lots of things, or spend your money on a workshop where you can really learn one-on-one from an instructor that makes such a big difference very quickly to your overall quality of photography and your level of competence. It's just amazing what you can do sitting there with the subject in front of you. And it's like speaking a language. It's like, you can learn from a textbook or Duolingo or whatever, but then if you're thrown off of a plane in the middle of Argentina, you're just kind of like, and you need to order breakfast. It's like, man, that really helps you learn quickly. So yeah, so I highly recommend those. Contact me if you guys are interested in workshops. I'm based on the West Coast right now. That might be changing soon. I might be heading y'all's way to Alabama. We'll see. But yeah, I'm around. These workshops are around. And there's a lot of YouTube tutorials and things like that out there. So excellent. Thank you guys so much for having me and for joining and for discussing awesome photography with me.
Thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. So I linked the old YouTube video. As soon as this recording ends, I'll save this and I'll send it to the ESCF pages for distribution to anyone there. So cool. Excellent. Love the shirt, Ashley. That's awesome. That's another one of Shahan's designs. That guy is just awesome. Awesome stuff. So, oh, did I miss messages? Okay, excellent. All right. So yeah, please feel free to email me or get in contact with me more. And yeah, hit me up on all my social media and stuff if you have any images you want to show me. Say, hey, what can I fix about this? How would you recommend using this? And we'll do some more Zoom chats and stuff one-on-one later. If anybody, I'm always happy to discuss photography. So we'll go from there. Cool deal. Well, thank you guys. All right.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. All right. Well, you guys have a good rest of your day. Go take some photos.
Bye.
And we'll see you next time. All right.